Welcome to Faith and Science. I'm Dr. John Ashton. You know, when we're talking to people about science and the area of the supernatural is sort of something that's taboo. Well, you know, that's nothing to do with science. But in actual fact, belief in the supernatural, and in particular belief in the Bible as a report of man's dealings with a supernatural God, our Creator, actually underpins modern science. Now, of course, when we read in the media and we hear all the the popular sort of accounts of leading evolutionists in particular and atheists, and they talk about belief in the supernatural. No, scientists don't go there, but in actual fact, as I've just said, this belief in a creator, belief in a supernatural God, in other words, belief in this intelligence outside of humanity has actually underpinned the foundations of modern science and underpinned the beliefs of the most of the scientists that laid the foundations upon which we do modern research today. And as I think about a lot of the research that is being done today, we're filling in some of the gaps that was left between from the pioneers. But some of the pioneers like James Clerk Maxwell, Einstein, Newton, and many of the physicists in particular of modern time and the chemists of the 20th century really built a really, really strong framework for science today. And as we, fill in the areas of research in science, particularly so in the areas of biology, as we understand more about the human microbiome and the biochemistry of the human body, which enables us to develop, better drugs and fight disease. As we understand now more about electronics and superconductors and semiconductors, these have enabled us to develop our modern computer systems that we have. And of course the development of radio communications and particularly lightweight battery systems that have enabled space travel. So the chemistry behind these this technology that we're using today, the principles of the chemistry and physics, much of it was laid down in the latter part of the 19th century and the 20th century by scientists who were Christians. I read an interesting article. It was titled "The Biblical Roots of Modern Science," and it was written by Dr. Jonathan Sarfati, who is he trained as a physical chemist, but he's a brilliant logical mind. I've seen him play chess blindfolded with, I think there were 12 people he was playing blindfold. So he was just told what the moves were for the people. And this was simultaneously all at the same time, and he could remember and picture the chessboards. And I don't think he lost any games. I think he drew a couple. And he has sort of looked at this data, but he actually reports on some research that has been done relatively recently. And this was made a very interesting article. So the subtitle of this piece was called "A Christian Worldview," and in particular, a plain understanding of scriptures and Adam's fall was essential for the rise of modern science. Now, again, this would make, most particularly, secular media commentators, think, what are we saying about this? Because we know that there's this move, particularly in Western countries, to remove the Bible from education, to remove knowledge of the biblical account from education. And I guess one of the reasons that is argued there, how do we know that Christianity is the true religion? What about all the other, different faiths are and so forth? But in actual fact, Christianity is a very historical religion, and it's founded also on prophecy. In other words, there were prophecies and unquestionable prophecies. We have the historical evidence of documents that were written hundreds of years before the birth and crucifixion of Christ that predicted the birth and crucifixion of Christ and the actual time when it would happen. And these, prophecies are powerful corroboration of the supernatural nature of the Bible and of the truth of Christianity. And so this sets Christianity apart from virtually all the other religions. Now, what is noticed in this article too, that many atheists and their and even some church folk now have this belief that science and the Bible account are sort of opposed to one another, almost like enemies. And yet, as historians of science, people who have studied the history of science, and even non-Christians now have pointed out that modern science first flourished under a Christian worldview. And in earlier cultures such as Greece and China and Arabia, science really didn't flourish there. Maths flourished, particularly in Arabia, but science didn't flourish. And there are a number of reasons for this, of course. And some of these other cultures were looking for purpose, whereas under the Christian culture, the belief in a rational creator led the scientists in the Western culture, in the Christian culture, to sort of understand the logic. They believed that God was, for example, a mathematician, that God arranged things in a logical, orderly fashion. And it's interesting that really when you think about it, an orderly universe makes perfect sense only if it were made by an orderly creator. And this has been recognised by, for example, an evolutionary anthropologist and science writer Lorraine Isley stated that the philosophy of experimental science began its discoveries and made use of its methods in the faith, not knowledge that it was dealing with a rational universe controlled by a creator who did not act upon whim or interfere with the forces he had in operation. It is surely one of the curious paradoxes of history that science, which professionally has little to do with faith, owes its origins to an act of faith that the universe can be rationally interpreted, and that science today is sustained by that interpretation. So as I said, that was an evolutionary anthropologist, Lorraine Isley, and if anyone is interested in that, that's a quote on page 62 of Isley's book, Darwin's Century, Evolution and the Men Who Discovered It. But it's interesting that so we have an evolutionist admitting that the foundation of science was based on the assumption that there was a creator God who organised things in a logical way. The other, the converse of that is, of course, that if atheism was true or polytheism is true, then there's no way to deduce from these belief systems that the universe is or should be orderly. And this is a very important philosophical point, and that's, of course, why many philosophers admit that the evidence is overwhelming, that there is some supernatural creator, intelligent being behind our existence. And as I said earlier, one of the reasons why Christianity is such a strong religion in terms of its logic and common sense is that not only is there the evidence from experience that Christianity is true, but we have the evidence from fulfilled prophecy that Christianity, that the Bible account is true, and that Jesus really was the Son of God, as predicted by the Bible prophecies hundreds of years before, and he came just at that time. And the other thing is that Genesis as well gives us permission to investigate creation. So God was free to create as he pleased, and so where one of the ways of looking at this is in areas where the Bible is silent, the only way to find out how creation works is to experiment rather than rely on man-made philosophies, as did the ancient Greeks. And so, again here, this belief that there was a creator God and that man was given dominion over creation, again, this belief led to our understanding of science. And the point that's being made here is that often people say that, or people think that science and religion are opposed, as mentioned earlier. But what the point that is being made here by these authors is that the Bible talks about man's interaction with God. And as we learn more we can learn more about God by studying his creation and the order there. And this is what we find. We find this tremendous design in nature. And another sociologist and author, Rodney Stark, points out that science was not the work of Western secularists or even deists. It was entirely the work of devout believers in an active, conscious creator God. And again, that comes from, that's a quote from Stark's book, published by Princeton University Press in 2003, and it's titled For the Glory of God, How Monotheism Led to Reformations, Science, Witch Hunts and the End of Slavery. So that's an interesting book by Stark, published by Princeton University Press, and that quote comes from page 367. So here's some interesting points. Yeah, another thing is, of course, that science requires that we can think rationally and that results should be reported honestly. And, of course, this is what the whole teaching of the Bible is. When the Bible says, one of the 10 Commandments is to tell the truth, to not tell lies. And this is something that is really fundamental in science, and this is something that scientists assume. We all, as a scientist, we assume that other scientists are speaking the truth, that they haven't fudged their measurements, they haven't shown bias and altered the results in some way. And, of course, every so often we hear about people who have fudged the results. And this is really, really bad, because science is built up on the whole concept that you discover something and you truthfully report what you have discovered in the scientific literature and at conferences and so forth, so that others can build on that, so that together we can understand life on Earth and the universe and so forth. And ultimately for good cause. In other words, we're studying science, we're studying how biochemistry works and this sort of thing, so that we can help improve health. We study how ecosystems work and so forth. So hopefully we can be stewards of our planet and conserve our environment so that we can enjoy it longer and have sustainable food supplies and all these sort of things. So when you think about it, much of modern science depends on the Christian moral values, and particularly the values that Jesus taught, that we are to love one another, we are to care for one another. And we, they have the famous story of that Jesus told of the Good Samaritan, of the man that was set upon by robbers, and it was a a complete stranger, somebody who would normally be regarded as an enemy, who came and found him almost dead on the side of the road, picked him up, put him on his donkey, took him to an inn, paid the innkeeper for his accommodation and told the innkeeper, look after him. When I come back, I'll pay anything I owe. And Jesus said, who was the neighbour to that friend, to that poor man who'd been attacked by robbers? And, they said the one that showed kindness to him. And so these are the whole principles, these principles that underpin Christianity, are really the principles that underpin how, science should work. And it's interesting that, of course, people have this impression too and tend to blame, the Christian church for the suppression of science, particularly during the Dark Ages. And, there's a number of issues here. And, of course, we need to remember that there are many people who have claimed to be Christians but actually don't live by the teachings of Jesus, don't live by the teachings of Christianity and what God revealed, particularly in the area of love thy neighbour, and forgive your enemies, these sort of things. And it's interesting if we look at the Dark Ages, science, as I said, requires that we think rationally. And again, and report things honestly and according to the teachings of the Bible. But really, if you adopt an evolutionary view, why? Why would that be so? If there's an advantage in being dishonest, if there's an advantage in fudging the results, which means that you get ahead in your university career and you earn more money and so forth, and you have greater influence, then that's the evolutionary view. But we can see really it breaks down. It's the biblical view that is sustainable, to be honest, to be fair, to do the right thing. The evolutionary viewpoint would be quite comfortable with fudging results if that meant that you could get ahead. And so we can see here that there are some major flaws with this whole concept, particularly of young people today, just being taught evolution. And as I was beginning to say, there's this criticism of the church, but and by many people with this a very popular view. But in actual fact, many historians now are recognising that the Dark Ages was far from dark, particularly from the point of view of science. It was actually a period of great scientific advances stemming from the logical thought patterns of the medieval scholastic philosophers of the church, and also the extensive inventiveness and mechanical ingenuity developed in monasteries at that time where they had time. Now, this period saw the development of water and wind power, magnificent architecture, the ability to build quite amazing architecture. It led to the development of the blast furnace and quite a bit more actually. This is noted in another book actually by some authors, V. Carroll and D. Shiflett, Shiflett. The book's called Christianity on Trial, Arguments Against Anti-Religious Bigotry, and that's was in Encounter Books, which was published in 2001. And you can that was an area, essentially a summary from their chapter 3. Another thing was, of course, it was in the 1300s that John Buridan developed the concept of impetus, which is essentially the same as momentum. And that, previously, of course, Aristotle had argued that all moving objects required a force, but Buridan proposed that after leaving the arm of the thrower, the projectile would be moved by an impetus given by the thrower. And, of course, that was the forerunner of Isaac Newton's first law of motion. Now, it's very, very interesting work has come out quite recently by James Hannam, who he recently earned his doctorate in the area of history of science from the University of Cambridge. He points out that during the Middle Ages, the Catholic Church actively supported a great deal of science, but it also decided that philosophical speculation should not impinge on theology. So it goes on to say, furthermore, contrary to popular belief, the Church never supported the idea that the earth is flat, never banned human dissection, and certainly never burnt anyone at the stake for scientific ideas. And they might have done lots of other bad things over theological ideas, but they didn't over scientific ideas. He then goes on to say, popular opinion, journalistic cliché, and misinformed historians notwithstanding, recent research has shown that the Middle Ages was a period of enormous advances in science, technology and culture. The compass, paper, printing, stirrups and gunpowder all appeared in Western Europe between AD 500 and AD 1500. And again, that's from James Hannam, who got his PhD at Cambridge fairly recently. And it's quite an interesting book, actually. It's by Hannam. It's called God's Philosophers, How the Medieval World Laid the Foundations of Modern Science. And what I just read out there is from pages 2 to 3. And that's published by Icon Books in 2009. So that's a philosopher of science who just earned his doctorate looking at this at the University of Cambridge there. So this is quite a little bit closer to home. There are other scientists that such as Peter Harrison, a professor of history and philosophy at Bond University in Queensland, Australia, and he's actually now the Andreas Idios Professor of Science and Religion at the University of Oxford. And it's interesting what he says, that to counter this common misunderstanding, and he writes, it is commonly supposed that when in the early modern period individuals began to look at the world in a different way, they could no longer believe what they read in the Bible. In this book, I shall suggest that the reverse is the case, that when the 16th century people began to read the Bible in a different way, they found themselves forced to jettison traditional conceptions of the world. And Harrison's book, by the way, is called The Bible, Protestantism and the Rise of Natural Science. And that is published by Cambridge University Press in 2001. So that was, again, Dr. Peter Harrison, who was, as I said, a professor of history and philosophy at Bond University, but now is professor of science and religion at the University of Oxford. And so here we can see these are the leading scholars in the world that are looking at the evidence that the Bible has paid, and particularly as people read the Bible and believed the Bible, that science really began to take great advances. And it seems to me just such a shame that today we are trying to suppress the reading of the Bible in our education system. We are trying to suppress the Bible. And we can see that this is, as some of these writers claim, it's, we have these, media people that are, and evolutionists and this sort of thing that are trying to say, well, science has now disproved the Bible, where in actual fact the Bible led to the foundation of science. And Professor Harrison goes on, strange as it may seem, the Bible played a positive role in the development of science. And he goes on, had it not been for the rise of literal interpretation of the Bible and the subsequent appropriation of biblical narratives by early modern scientists, modern science may not have arisen at all. In sum, the Bible and its literal interpretation, notice that, literal interpretation, have played a vital role in the development of Western science. And that was from an article that Professor Harrison published. It was called Bible and the Rise of Science. It was published in Australasian Science, volume 23, pages 14 to 15, and 2002. And that was volume 23, number 3, if you want to read the full article there. So, when we consider this again, we have so much evidence. One of the interesting things, as I mentioned earlier, there's this belief in the supernatural. Belief in this supernatural creator God was there. And one of the things that Professor Harrison has researched is another commonly overlooked factor in the development of science, and that is the belief in the literal fall of a literal first man, Adam. These founding modern scientists, including Francis Bacon, reasoned that the fall not only destroyed man's innocence, but it also greatly impaired his knowledge. The first problem was remedied by the innocent last Adam, Jesus Christ. His sacrifice enabled our sin to be imputed or credited to him, and his perfect life enabled his righteousness to be imputed to believers in him. But as for recovering what they believed to be Adam's encyclopedia knowledge, they looked to science. And so Harrison explains, new literal readings of the creation narratives in Genesis provided 17th century thinkers with powerful motivating images for pursuing the sciences. Adam was thought of to have possessed perfect knowledge of all the sciences, and a knowledge lost to posterity when he fell from grace and was expelled from the Garden of Eden, and so forth. And so, as I said, you can read about that in Harrison's book and a lot more in God's Philosophers, How the Medieval World Laid Bare the Foundations of Modern Science, published by Icon Books in 2009. As we can see, modern science is based on the belief in a supernatural creator God. And I'd encourage you all to read about that super creator God in the Bible. You've been listening to Faith and Science. I'm Dr. John Ashton. Remember, if you'd like to listen to more of these program or re-listen to this program, just go to Google 3abnaustralia.org.au and click on the listen button. Have a great day.
You've been listening to a production of 3ABN Australia Radio.